December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The winter storm had turned the sky into a wall of gray steel. Snowflakes swirled through the darkness like ghosts dancing over frozen pine trees. Somewhere below, American soldiers huddled in foxholes surrounded by German forces. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. A single German Junkers 88 bomber cut through the storm. Inside the cockpit, the pilot felt safe. The weather had grounded every Allied fighter in Europe. For once, the Luftwaffe owned the night sky again. He was wrong. 200 feet behind him, invisible in the darkness and fog, a black shape moved through the storm like a predator. The pilot inside wore no fear on his face, only focus. His hands rested steady on the controls. His eyes scanned the instruments glowing faintly green in the cockpit. From the seat behind him, a voice crackled through the intercom. Calm, precise. Contact confirmed. Range closing. 400 feet. The pilot eased the throttles forward. Just a touch. Not too fast. Speed management was everything in the dark. Overshoot your prey, and you would never find it again. 300 feet. The bomber ahead flew straight and level. The German crew had no idea death was following them home. 200 feet. You have visual. The pilot squinted into the darkness. There, a shadow darker than the night. The twin tails of the Junkers. He could see the exhaust flames now, 2 orange points in the blackness. His finger moved to the trigger. 4 20mm cannons erupted to life. The muzzle flash lit up the storm for half a second. Tracers reached across the gap like fingers of fire. They found their target. The Junkers exploded. A ball of orangey flame bloomed in the darkness, impossibly bright after so much black. Debris tumbled through the air. The shockwave rocked the black fighter as it flew straight through the fireball. The German crew never knew what hit them. This moment, repeated hundreds of times across 2 years of war, was the promise the Black Widow would keep. But first, we must understand how that promise was made. This was the future of warfare. This was the promise of a new kind of hunter. This was the story of how America learned to fight in complete darkness. This was the story of the P-61 Black Widow. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, we must go back. Back to when the night belonged only to the enemy. Back to when American pilots did not even know such fighting was possible. Back to the fires of London. September 1940, London, England. The sirens began at dusk. That low rising wail that made every person in the city look up at the sky with dread. In the American embassy, military observers stood at the windows and watched the sun go down. They knew what was coming. The Blitz had been going on for weeks now. Every night, German bombers crossed the English Channel under cover of darkness. Every night, they dropped their bombs on British cities while people slept. And every night, the Royal Air Force scrambled their fighters to stop them. It never worked. One of the American observers, an Army Air Corps major, lit a cigarette and checked his watch. 8:15. The Germans would be here in 15 minutes. Like clockwork. Do the British have anything that works at night? Asked a younger officer beside him. The major shook his head. They have night fighter squadrons, but they are flying outdated aircraft. Blenheims mostly. Maybe a few bow fighters if they are lucky. What about radar? Ground-based only. The controllers can get a fighter within 5 or 10 miles of a German formation. After that, the pilot has to spot the enemy by eyesight. The younger officer looked out at the darkening sky. How do you see anything up there at night? You do not. The major took a drag from his cigarette. That is the problem. Right on schedule, the drone of engines began. Distant at first, then growing louder. The anti-aircraft guns opened up, sending tracers arcing into the sky like deadly fireworks. But the German bombers flew high, too high for the guns to reach with any accuracy. The first bombs began to fall. The explosions walked across the city. Each one a flash of yellow light followed by a thunderous boom. Buildings collapsed. Gas mains erupted into pillars of flame. The Americans watched in silence as London began to burn. A British RAF officer joined them at the window. His uniform was rumpled. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "Did you get any promo?" the major asked. The RAF officer shook his head. "We scrambled 6 fighters. 5 never made contact. The 6th thought he saw something and fired blind into the darkness. Wasted his ammunition on empty sky." "What about the new radar sets?" Not accurate enough, not yet. The British officer stared out at the fires. We can track them coming across the channel. We can vector our fighters into the general area. But finding a single aircraft in the dark with nothing but your eyes, it is like searching for a black cat in a coal mine. Another wave of bombs hit. Closer this time. The building shook. The American major crushed out his cigarette. He had seen enough. In the morning, he would write his report to Washington. The message would be simple and terrifying. If the Germans ever decided to bomb American cities at night, the United States Army Air Corps would be completely helpless to stop them. The report landed on desks in Washington 3 weeks later. The response was immediate and urgent. America had devoted zero resources to night fighting. The entire doctrine of air warfare had been built around one assumption. The bomber would always get through. Modern bombers were too fast to catch, too high to intercept, and too heavily armed to seriously damage. So why would anyone need to bomb at night? That assumption was now burning in the streets of London. Emergency meetings were called. Generals who had spent their entire careers thinking about daylight operations suddenly faced a new reality. Wars would not stop when the sun went down, and America was completely unprepared. The race had begun, a race against time to solve a problem that seemed nearly impossible. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? The answer, they quickly realized, lay in a new technology that most people had never heard of, a technology that could see in the dark. Radar, late 1940, Wright Field, Ohio. The British had been working on radar since before the war began. Chain-home stations dotted the English coast, able to detect incoming aircraft at ranges of over 100 miles. But these systems were massive, huge towers with enormous antenna arrays. The equipment to process the signals filled entire buildings. The idea of putting such a system in an aircraft seemed absurd, but the British had made a breakthrough, a device called the cavity magnetron. This small tube could generate powerful microwaves using minimal power. It was the key to miniaturization, the key to making radar portable enough to fly. In an act of remarkable trust, the British shared their research with America. They handed over their secrets freely, knowing that American industrial might could turn those secrets into weapons faster than Britain ever could. American scientists got to work immediately. Within months, they had designed the first airborne radar system. It was still crude, still experimental, but it worked. Now they just needed an aircraft to put it in. The Army Air Corps issued a request for proposals. The specifications were unusual. They wanted a fighter, but not a normal one. This fighter needed to carry multiple crew members. It needed to stay airborne for 8 hours at a time. It needed space for the new radar equipment, and it needed to be fast enough to catch bombers. Most aviation companies looked at the requirements and shook their heads. It was asking for too much. A fighter that big would be too slow, too clumsy. It would never work. But one man thought differently. Jack Northrop ran his own aircraft company in California. He had a reputation for radical designs, aircraft that looked like nothing else in the sky. When he saw the Army's request, he smiled. This was his kind of challenge. The design he submitted was unlike any pursuit aircraft ever conceived. Twin engines, twin booms, a central nacelle housing the crew. The wingspan stretched 66 feet across, dwarfing other fighters. Tricycle landing gear for better ground handling, and a special feature called zap flaps that could deploy across the entire wingspan to slow the aircraft without losing control. The Army looked at the design and saw a monster, the largest fighter aircraft ever proposed. They loved it. The project was approved in early 1941. Production began immediately, but turning drawings into reality proved harder than anyone expected. The aircraft required cutting-edge components, special alloys, new hydraulic systems, advanced electronics. Many of these same parts were also needed for the new B-29 Superfortress bomber. The bomber took priority. The night fighter program began to fall behind schedule. Meanwhile, the design itself was being refined. The crew configuration was settled. Pilot in front, radar operator behind him facing backward, gunner in the rear operating a remote-controlled top turret with 450 caliber machine guns. The main armament sparked debate. Eventually, they decided on 420mm Hispano cannons mounted in the belly. This made the aircraft one of the only American fighters to carry 4 of these powerful weapons as standard. But there was one more detail that would define this aircraft forever. The paint scheme. Night fighters needed to be invisible. That meant black paint. But not just any black. The engineers specified a special, glossy black paint that would absorb light from above and reflect light away from below. This made the aircraft harder to see from the ground and harder to illuminate with searchlights. When the first prototype rolled out of the Northrop factory painted in its dark livery, someone said it looked like a creature from a nightmare. A worker suggested a name, Black Widow, the deadliest spider in North America, a creature that hunted in darkness, a creature whose bite was lethal. The name stuck. The P-61 Black Widow had been born. But building the aircraft was only half the challenge. Someone had to fly it. Someone had to learn how to fight in complete darkness using technology that had never been tested in combat. Someone had to become the first night fighter pilots in American history. The problem was simple. Nobody knew how to do it. Night flying was dangerous enough on its own, taking off in darkness, landing in darkness, navigating by instruments. All of these skills required training and practice. But night fighting was something else entirely. You had to locate an enemy aircraft you could not see. You had to close with that aircraft without overshooting it. You had to identify it as hostile without getting close enough to be shot down yourself. And you had to destroy it before it destroyed you. All in pitch blackness. The Army Air Corps decided that such a dangerous mission could only be assigned to volunteers. They put out a call. Any pilot who wanted to try this new kind of warfare was welcome to apply. They expected a handful of responses. They got hundreds. Young pilots from across America volunteered for the program. Some were attracted by the novelty, some by the challenge. Some simply wanted to be part of something new and important. Among those volunteers were 3 men who would write their names into history. 3 men who would prove that the impossible was merely difficult. The first was Dale Haberman, 24 years old, from Iowa, quiet and methodical. His father had been a pilot in the First World War, killed in a barnstorming accident when Dale was 12. Dale grew up believing that night flying could be made safe if done scientifically, carefully, with proper training and discipline. The night fighter program seemed designed for him. The second was Paul Smith, 26 years old, from Pennsylvania. Before the war, he had worked as a crop duster, flying low over farmland in all kinds of weather. He was competitive, bold. He wanted to be the first ace in this new field. He wanted his name in the history books. The third was Carroll Smith, no relation to Paul, 28 years old, career military. He had trained on P-38 Lightnings but volunteered for night fighters because he believed they would be decisive in the Pacific. He was older than most pilots, more experienced, a natural leader who would eventually rise to the rank of major. These 3 men, along with hundreds of others, reported to training bases across America. They were about to learn a new way to fight, a new way to kill, and a new way to die. The training program was built from scratch. There were no experienced instructors, no established curriculum. Everything was trial and error, guess and check. The volunteers began with basic night flying, taking off after sunset, flying patterns in darkness, landing with minimal lights. It was disorienting at first. The human body was not designed to fly without visual references. The inner ear played tricks. Pilots felt like they were climbing when they were diving, felt like they were turning when they were flying straight. Learning to trust the instruments was the first lesson. Your body will lie to you. The instruments will not. They practiced for weeks, flying in shifts after dark, learning to navigate by compass and airspeed, learning to judge altitude without seeing the ground. Slowly, the darkness became less terrifying, but they were not training in Black Widows yet. Not at first. The aircraft were still being built, still being tested, so the volunteers trained in P-70s instead. These were modified Douglas A-20 bombers hastily converted into night fighters. They were slower than the P-61, less maneuverable, but they had radar and room for a 2-man crew. The radar training was its own challenge. The radar operator sat facing backward. His world was a green screen showing glowing blips. Each blip was an aircraft, but the screen could not tell you if that aircraft was friend or enemy. It could not tell you altitude. It could only tell you direction and range. The operator had to guide the pilot by voice alone, speaking constantly over the intercom, calling out corrections. Come left 5 degrees, increase speed. Target at 2 miles. Steady, steady. Come right 2 degrees. The pilot had to trust that voice completely. Flying blind, turning and climbing and diving based entirely on what someone else was seeing on a glowing screen. It required a bond between crew members unlike anything in other aircraft. If the radar operator made a mistake, both men died. If the pilot ignored directions, both men died. They had to work as one. Dale Haberman was paired with a radar operator named Ray Mooney. Mooney had been a radio engineer before the war. Calm, precise. He spoke in measured tones even when things went wrong. Dale trusted him instantly. Paul Smith was paired with Robert Tierney. Tierney was from Brooklyn, quick-witted, fast-talking. He and Paul argued constantly during training, but the arguments were productive. They were learning each other's rhythms, learning how to communicate under stress. Carroll Smith chose his own radar operator after watching several candidates work. He picked a quiet man from Texas named James Phillips. Phillips never got flustered, never panicked. Carroll trained him not as a crew member, but as a weapons officer, someone who controlled the hunt as much as the pilot did. The training intensified. Night intercept exercises. Ground controllers would vector the P-70s toward target aircraft flown by other trainees. The night fighters would have to locate the target on radar, close within visual range, identify it, then simulate an attack. In the beginning, most intercepts failed. The night fighters would overshoot the target and lose it in the darkness, or they would approach too slowly and the target would escape. Speed management was everything. Too fast and you flew past your prey. Too slow and it slipped away. They practiced night after night, learning the rhythms of the hunt, learning to feel the aircraft even when they could not see it, learning to interpret the smallest details. The sound of the engines, the vibration of the controls, the way the wind noise changed when you turned. And they learned the most important rule of night fighting. Never look at a light. A single bright light could destroy your night vision for minutes. In combat, minutes meant death. So the trainees learned to live in darkness. They wore special adaptation glasses during the day, filtering out most light. By sunset, their eyes had already adjusted to darkness. When they climbed into the cockpit, they could see better than most people could imagine. They ate special diets, rich in vitamins, carrots and other foods high in nutrients that enhance vision. Some of it was science. Some of it was superstition. But the pilots were willing to try anything, and slowly they became creatures of the night. But the P-61 was still not ready. Month after month passed, the aircraft was delayed by production problems, parts shortages, design changes. The volunteers kept training in P-70s, waiting for the real fighter to arrive. Some of them would never see it. It happened on a cold night in October 1943. A routine training flight, two P-70s taking off from the same airfield 5 minutes apart, both climbing into darkness. The first aircraft leveled off at 6,000 feet. The pilot was practicing instrument approaches. The radar operator was tracking other aircraft in the area. The second P-70 was climbing through 5,000 feet when it happened. The collision was instantaneous. Neither crew saw it coming. The two aircraft struck each other in the darkness, metal tearing metal. Both planes disintegrated. Flaming wreckage fell toward the earth like falling stars. All 4 men died on impact. Dale Haberman was on the ground when it happened. He saw the fireball in the sky. For a terrible moment, he thought it was an exercise. A flare dropped to simulate combat. Then the burning pieces began raining down, and he understood. Other pilots rushed to the crash site. There was nothing to be done. The wreckage was scattered across a mile of farmland. They found pieces of both aircraft mixed together, impossible to separate. The training program stopped for 3 days. Memorial services were held. The dead were buried with full military honors. But there were no newspaper stories, no public announcements. The entire program was classified. These men had died in secret. Their sacrifice would remain unknown. Colonel Winston Kratz, the director of night fighter training, gathered the surviving pilots in a hangar. His voice was steady, but his eyes were tired. Those men died learning something no one had ever tried before, he said. They died so the rest of you would know better, so the next crews would not make the same mistakes. Their sacrifice has meaning. It has a value for you. Do not waste it. The pilots stood in silence. Dale Haberman clenched his fists. He had come here to prove night flying could be safe. Now 4 men were dead. But he understood what Kratz was saying. This was the cost of pioneering. Someone always paid the price for progress. The training resumed the next day. More careful now, more deliberate. But the volunteers did not quit. If anything, they were more determined. Those 4 men had not died for nothing. The survivors would make sure of that. Finally, in early 1944, the first P-61 Black Widows began arriving at the training bases. When the pilots saw them for the first time, they stopped and stared. The aircraft was enormous. It dwarfed the P-70s they had been flying. The twin booms stretched back like the wings of some prehistoric creature. The black paint seemed to absorb light, making the aircraft look like a hole in the sky even during the day. Someone said it looked like Batman's plane. The pilots laughed. And oddly enough, Batman's comic featured an all-black stealth aircraft during the same period the P-61 was in peak development. Coincidence, probably. But they knew the comparison was apt. This was an aircraft designed to strike from the shadows, to hunt in darkness, to be invisible. They could not wait to take it to war. The first combat squadrons were formed in February 1944. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron would deploy to England. The 6th would go to the Pacific. Others would follow. Before they left, the crews were given a final briefing. The mission parameters were explained one last time. Ground controllers would vector them toward enemy aircraft. The onboard radar would guide them to visual range. Then they would identify the target and destroy it. The rules of engagement were clear. Visual confirmation was required before firing. You had to see the enemy with your own eyes. But at night, national markings were invisible. Identification had to be done by silhouette, by the shape of the aircraft against the stars. The pilots spent their last days memorizing recognition charts. German aircraft, Japanese aircraft, every type that might be encountered, every variant. They studied until they could identify any aircraft from any angle in less than a second, because in combat, a second would be all they had. One more thing worried them above all else: friendly fire. Allied anti-aircraft crews shot at anything that flew at night. They had standing orders. If it is in the air after dark, it is probably enemy. Shoot first. Ask questions later. The Blitz had traumatized them. The German night raids had scarred them. They would not hesitate. The night fighters would have to navigate through friendly fire zones. They would have to avoid their own anti-aircraft batteries while hunting the enemy. It was perhaps the most dangerous part of the mission. More dangerous than the Germans. More dangerous than the Japanese. Your own side could kill you just as easily. Dale Haberman wrote a letter home before deploying. He did not tell his mother what he was training for. That was classified. But he tried to explain how he felt. Mom, I cannot tell you what I will be doing over there. But I want you to know that I chose this. I volunteered. And if something happens, if I do not come back, I want you to know that I believed in what I was doing. I believed it was important. He sealed the letter and sent it. Then he boarded the transport ship with Ray Mooney and the rest of the squadron. They sailed for England in March 1944. Paul Smith and Robert Tierney went with them. Carol Smith and James Phillips boarded a different ship. They were headed to the Pacific, to Saipan, to a war that was just as brutal but fought across vast oceans instead of crowded skies. The 3 men did not know each other yet. They had trained at different bases. They would serve in different theaters. But they were bound together by something deeper than friendship or geography. They were the first, the pioneers, the men who would prove that humans could fight and kill in complete darkness. The aircraft was built, the men were trained, the technology was tested, but war never waits for perfection. They would learn the rest in combat. In 4 months, the killing would begin. June 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. The island had been secured 3 weeks earlier. American Marines had paid for every yard of ground in blood. Now the airfields were operational. Fighter squadrons were arriving, and among them, painted black as midnight, came the first P-61 Black Widows to see combat. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron touched down on Isley Field under a blazing tropical sun. Dale Haberman climbed out of the cockpit of Moon Happy and looked around. The island was still smoldering. Artillery craters pocked the coral runway. Wrecked Japanese aircraft lay in twisted heaps at the field's edge. Ray Mooney joined him on the wing. His radar operator's uniform was soaked with sweat. The black paint made the aircraft into an oven during the day. "This is it," Ray said. "The real thing." Dale nodded. 4 months of training, 4 months of preparation. Now they would find out if any of it actually worked. The squadron commander gathered the crews in a tent that evening. Maps covered the table. The tactical situation was explained. The Japanese had lost air superiority over the Marianas. Their carriers were destroyed. Their airfields on nearby islands were under constant bombardment, but they had not stopped flying. Every night, single Japanese aircraft came over Saipan, sometimes bombers, sometimes fighters. They dropped bombs on the airfield. They strafed tents. They did not do much damage, but they kept the Marines awake. They created fear. They reminded everyone that the war was not over. These nuisance raids had to be stopped. The problem was finding them. The ground radar crews in the Pacific were less experienced than their counterparts in Europe. The equipment was newer, the operators were still learning, and the results showed it. The squadron intelligence officer told them a story. It had happened just 3 weeks earlier, before the Black Widows arrived. The night fighters then had been flying P-70s, the converted bombers. One night, ground radar detected a bogey a few miles offshore. They scrambled a P-70 to intercept. The pilot flew toward the contact. His radar operator picked it up. They began the pursuit. At the same time, another P-70 that had been on patrol for the past hour was flying back toward base. The ground controller saw this aircraft on his screen. He did not realize it was the other P-70 from his own squadron. He vectored the newly launched aircraft to intercept it. For the next 20 minutes, 2 American night fighters chased each other in circles over the dark Pacific, each radar operator watching the other's blip, each pilot trying to close within visual range, neither realizing they were hunting their own. Eventually, both aircraft flew over friendly anti-aircraft positions near the beach. The gunners opened fire on both of them. That finally broke up the chase. Both P-70s fled in different directions. Both landed safely. But it took an hour before anyone realized what had happened. The crews in the tent listened in silence. Then someone laughed nervously. The laughter spread, but it was hollow laughter, frightened laughter. Dale looked at Ray. His radar operator's face was serious. "That could be us," Ray said quietly. "Then we make sure it is not," Dale replied. "We communicate, we confirm, we do not assume anything." The briefing continued. The rules of engagement were reviewed. Visual identification was mandatory. The radar could not tell friend from foe. Only human eyes could make that determination. And at night, national markings were invisible. The pilots would have to identify aircraft by silhouette alone. They reviewed the recognition charts one more time. Japanese bombers, Japanese fighters, every type, every variant. The shapes had to be burned into memory. The first patrols began the next night. Dale and Ray took off after sunset. The feeling of flying over water in complete darkness was disorienting. No landmarks, no horizon, just stars above and black ocean below. The instruments were the only truth. They flew for 2 hours. Ground control vectored them towards several contacts. Each time Ray picked up the blip on radar. Each time Dale maneuvered to intercept. But every contact turned out to be nothing. Ghost returns, weather patterns, seabirds in large flocks. They landed frustrated. This was harder than training. The radar worked differently over water. The returns were less reliable, and the targets were far more elusive than the practice aircraft back home. But they kept trying, night after night, patrol after patrol, learning the rhythms of the Pacific War. Then on June 30th, everything changed. The alert came at 2300 hours. Ground radar had detected a bogey inbound from the northwest. Speed and altitude suggested a medium bomber with possible escort. Dale and Ray were already airborne. They had launched an hour earlier on routine patrol. Now ground control vectored them toward the contact. Bogey bearing 270, range 12 miles, vector to intercept. Dale turned moon-happy to the new heading. Ray hunched over his radar scope in the rear seat. The green screen glowed in the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then a faint blip appeared at the edge of the display. "Contact," Ray said. His voice was calm, but Dale could hear the tension underneath. "Bearing 275. Range 4 miles. Copy, 4 miles, talk me in. They had practiced this 100 times. But practice was always conducted with the knowledge that no one would die if you made a mistake. This was different. Somewhere ahead in the darkness was an enemy aircraft, men who would kill them if given the chance. Dale's hands felt slick on the controls. He wiped them one at a time on his flight suit. Range 3 miles, come left 2 degrees. The intercept was textbook. Ray called corrections smoothly. Dale followed each instruction precisely. The range closed. 2 miles, 1 mile, half a mile. You should have visual. Dale squinted into the darkness. At first he saw nothing but stars. Then his eyes caught movement, a shadow darker than the night. 2 shapes, no 3, wings and fuselage. Contact, twin engine, large. He closed the distance carefully. Not too fast. The Black Widow could overshoot easily if he was not careful. At 500 yards he could see it clearly now. A fat fuselage, 2 radial engines, twin tail fins. Betty bomber, he said. The Mitsubishi G4M. He had studied the silhouette for months. Then he saw something else. Tucked tight beneath the bomber's wing, another aircraft. Smaller, single engine. He has an escort, 0 underneath. The ground radar missed it. Ray checked his scope. The 2 aircraft were so close together they showed as a single return. Confirmed. 2 contacts merged. What do you want to do? Dale thought fast. The Betty was the primary threat. The bomber carried the payload, but the 0 was the danger. If the fighter saw them, this would turn into a dogfight. And dogfights in darkness usually ended with both aircraft going down. But the Black Widow's whole purpose was stealth. They were invisible. The Japanese crews did not know they were here. We take the bomber, Dale decided. Stay on him. He eased the throttles forward, closing the gap. The Betty and the 0 continued towards Saipan. Steady course, level flight, completely unaware. Dale's mouth was dry. His heart hammered in his chest. He had never killed anyone before. In a few seconds, that would change forever. At 700 feet, he decided it was close enough. Any closer and the debris from the bomber might hit them. He lined up the shot. The Betty's fuselage filled his gun sight. His finger tightened on the trigger. The 420mm cannons erupted to life. The recoil shook the Black Widow. Tracers reached across the gap. Every 5th round was a tracer. The others were invisible. But Dale could see where they were hitting. The Betty came apart. Cannon shells punched through the thin aluminum skin. One hit the fuel tank. The bomber exploded in a ball of orange fire that lit up the sky like noon. Dale flew straight through the fireball. Heat washed over the canopy. Debris rattled off the wings. The light was so bright after so much darkness that he was instantly blind. He pulled back on the stick by instinct, climbing away from where the bomber had been. His vision slowly returned. Purple after images floated in front of his eyes. He blinked them away. "Where is the 0?" he shouted. "Gone. He was there and now he is gone. Wait." Ray studied his scope. "Contact. Behind us. Close." The 0 pilot had seen the flash, had watched his bomber explode, and had somehow flipped his fighter over and pulled in behind the Black Widow in seconds. Tracers suddenly lit up the darkness around them. Green balls of fire streaming past the canopy. Dale felt impacts. Metal hitting metal. "He is shooting at us," Ray yelled. He was in the rear-facing seat, staring at the 0 head-on as it fired. "Dive left, dive left." Dale threw the Black Widow into a diving turn. The 0's tracers followed for a moment, then fell behind. He kept diving, 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet. The airspeed built rapidly. He leveled out at 1,000 feet. His breathing was ragged. Ray was calling out directions, but the words were not making sense. "Say again." "The contact is gone. He broke off. I think we lost him." Dale circled slowly. His eyes swept the darkness. But the 0 had vanished. Either the pilot had given up or had lost them in the dark. Either way, they were alive. He turned moon-happy towards Saipan. His hands were shaking now. The adrenaline crash was beginning. They landed 20 minutes later. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft. They found bullet holes in the tail section. 3 rounds had punched through the aluminum. 6 inches to the left, and they would have hit Ray. The intelligence officer debriefed them immediately. 1 confirmed kill. the Betty bomber. Both crew members would receive credit. In night fighters, unlike other aircraft, the pilot and radar operator shared every kill. It was a team effort. Neither could succeed without the other. Dale and Ray walked back to their tent in silence. Other pilots congratulated them, slapped their backs. But Dale barely heard them. In the tent, Ray sat down heavily on his cot. His hands were shaking. "I saw his face," Ray said quietly. "What?" "The Zero pilot. When he was shooting at us, I was looking right at him through the canopy. I saw his face." Dale did not know what to say. He sat on his own cot. They had been training for this for months, but nothing had prepared him for what it actually felt like. He had just killed men who never saw him coming. The Betty's crew had no warning, no chance to evade, no time to pray, and it did not feel the way he thought it would. It did not feel like victory. It felt like murder. But that was the job. That was what night fighters did. They struck from the shadows. They killed without warning. They were invisible hunters. Ray looked up. Will it get easier? Dale did not answer. He did not know. 2 weeks after Dale Haberman scored the first P-61 kill in the Pacific, the Black Widows in England finally drew blood. But their first victory would not come against the Luftwaffe. It would come against a machine, July 15th, 1944, Southern England. Lieutenant Herman Ernst was on patrol when the call came in. Ground control had detected a fast-moving contact crossing the English Channel. Speed estimated at 350 miles per hour. Course toward London. Ernst knew immediately what it was, a V-1 flying bomb. The Germans had begun launching these terror weapons weeks earlier. Unmanned rockets packed with explosives. They flew in a straight line until the fuel ran out. Then they fell and exploded. The British called them buzz bombs because of the sound their pulse jet engines made. Shooting them down was difficult. They were small, they were fast, and they flew low. Ernst pushed his Black Widow into a dive. The only way to catch a V-1 was to start high and dive after it. Even then, the P-61 was barely fast enough. The airspeed built. 300 miles per hour, 320, 340. The controls grew heavy. The aircraft began to shake. Then Ernst heard a loud bang, like a gunshot inside the fuselage. "Abort, abort," his radar operator shouted. "The tail cone just blew out." The plexiglass cone that enclosed the rear section had imploded from the pressure of the dive. Air was screaming through the gap. The aircraft was still controllable, but pieces were coming off. Ernst pulled out of the jet and headed back to base. The V-1 escaped. He landed safely, but the aircraft needed major repairs. It was another problem with the early P-61 models. The plexiglass components could not handle high-speed flight. The engineers would eventually fix it. But for now, diving too fast meant the aircraft came apart around you. Ernst got another chance the next day. Another V-1 launch was detected. This time, he was more careful. A controlled dive. Not too steep, not too fast. He caught up to the flying bomb over the channel. The V-1 flew straight and level, exactly as programmed. Ernst pulled alongside it. He could see the stubby wings, the pulse jet engine on top, the warhead in the nose. He dropped back behind it, lined up the shot, and fired. The V-1 exploded. Pieces tumbled into the sea below. Ernst circled the debris field once, then headed home. It was the first P-61 victory in the European theater. But Ernst knew it did not really count. Shooting down a robot was not the same as defeating an enemy pilot. That test was still coming. It came 3 weeks later, August 7th, 1944. Pilot Raymond Anderson and his radar operator, John Morris, were on a night patrol over France. Ground control vectored them toward a bogey heading west. Single aircraft, medium altitude. The intercept went smoothly. Morris picked up the contact on radar at 3 miles. He guided Anderson in with calm precision. At half a mile, Anderson got visual contact. "Junkers 88, he called out. The twin-engine bomber was a common sight over Europe. But this was the first one an American night fighter had encountered. Anderson approached from below and behind. The German crew never saw him. At 400 feet, he opened fire. The 4 cannons tore into the Ju-88. The bomber caught fire immediately. Anderson pulled away as it began to spiral down. He watched it fall. The fire spread. The wings folded. It hit the ground in a field below and exploded. Anderson and Morris returned to base. They made their report, but there was a problem. No one else had seen the kill. There were no wingmen to confirm it. The gun camera footage was nearly worthless in the darkness. Just muzzle flash and a brief glimpse of fire. Had they really shot down a bomber, or had they hit something else? A friendly aircraft, a civilian plane. The intelligence officers were skeptical. They began asking detailed questions. Anderson described the silhouette, the twin engines, the distinctive tail. Morris corroborated every detail. Finally, the next morning, a reconnaissance aircraft was sent to the area. They found the wreckage. German markings confirmed. Junkers 88. Official kill. But the experience highlighted a problem. Night fighter victories were extremely difficult to confirm. The darkness that protected the hunters also hid their accomplishments. Many kills would go unconfirmed. Many crews suspected their actual scores were much higher than their official tallies. It would become a source of frustration throughout the war. That same month, another controversy arose. This one would shake the night fighter program to its core. The Mosquito Affair. Army Air Force brass had been watching the P-61 program with skepticism. The aircraft was expensive. It was slow compared to other fighters. And some generals doubted it could hold its own against German aircraft in a real fight. An alternative existed, the British de Havilland Mosquito, a twin-engine fighter bomber that was faster than almost anything in the sky. Versatile, proven in combat, and the British were willing to sell some to America. A competition was arranged, the P-61 against the Mosquito, a fly-off to determine which aircraft was superior. The tests were held in England in late summer. Both aircraft were pushed to their limits. Speed tests at various altitudes, maneuverability trials, rate of climb, combat simulations. The results shocked everyone. The P-61 won decisively. It was faster than the Mosquito at all altitudes tested. It could turn inside the British fighter, and its rate of climb was superior. The American crews were elated. They had proven their aircraft. The doubters were wrong. But Colonel Winston Kratz was not convinced. Kratz was the director of night fighter training, the man who had overseen the entire program from the beginning. He had bet $500 on the Mosquito to win, and he had lost. Later, he would write in his diary that he believed the British had thrown the competition, that they had deliberately held back because they needed every Mosquito for their own operations. Berlin raids, North Africa missions. They could not afford to give any aircraft to America. I am absolutely sure to this day that the British were lying like troopers, he wrote. The P-61 was not as fast as the Mosquito, but the British needed their aircraft, so they made sure we kept ours. Other pilots disagreed. They believed the test results were genuine. The P-61 was a good night fighter. Maybe not perfect, but good enough to do the job. The argument would never be fully resolved. But the P-61 was here to stay. For better or worse, it was America's night fighter. The crews would have to prove its worth in combat. Through late summer and into fall, the night fighter squadrons learned their craft through trial and error. Every mission taught new lessons. Some were written down in tactical manuals. Others were passed between crews in quiet conversations after landing. The blind fire technique was discovered by accident. A pilot had been vectored to a target by ground control. His radar operator confirmed the contact. But when they reached the intercept point, the pilot could not see anything. He circled in frustration. The bogey was there. The radar showed it clearly, but his eyes found only darkness. In desperation, he fired a burst into the empty sky ahead. Immediately, tracers answered him. The enemy gunner had been startled by the sudden muzzle flash and fired back instinctively. His tracers revealed his position. The pilot adjusted his aim and fired again. This time he hit something. The enemy aircraft went down. The technique spread quickly. When you could not find your target, visually fire blind. Make them reveal themselves. It did not always work, but it worked often enough to become standard procedure. Night vision discipline became paramount. Pilots learned to read instruments by touch in complete darkness. Every switch, every dial memorized by feel. Some crews developed their own communication codes. Clicks on the intercom, taps on the airframe, ways to signal without words when radio silence was critical. They ate foods rich in vitamins, carrots especially. Whether it actually helped or not was debatable, But the placebo effect was real. The pilots believed it made them sharper, and belief was powerful. Speed management remained the most difficult skill to master. Approaching a target too fast meant overshooting it. The Black Widow had zap flaps that could deploy to slow the aircraft dramatically, but using them required practice. Deploy them too early and you fell behind. Too late and you flew past your prey. The best pilots learned to feather the throttles, tiny adjustments, adding power for a second, reducing it, reading the closure rate from the radar operator's calls and adjusting instinctively. It was more art than science. Strange encounters happened regularly. The confusion of night combat led to bizarre situations that no one could have predicted. Lieutenant David Quartz of the 421st Squadron had perhaps the strangest engagement of all. Ground control vectored him toward a Betty bomber one night. Quartz and his radar operator began the pursuit. They closed within range. Quartz was preparing to fire when his radar operator suddenly shouted, pull off, something behind us." Another aircraft had appeared on radar directly behind them. Quartz broke away hard. As he turned, he saw the aircraft behind him open fire. The tracers did not come toward him. They went toward the Betty. The Japanese fighter escort had somehow gotten behind Quartz without being detected. But in the darkness and confusion, the Japanese pilot had fired at the wrong target. He shot down his own bomber. The Betty exploded and fell into the sea. Quartz and his radar operator stared in disbelief. They put in for a kill claim when they landed. But how could they claim credit for an aircraft they had not shot down? The Japanese pilot had killed his own wingman. The claim was denied. No credit given. But it went down as one of the strangest moments of the war. August 14, 1944, over France. The moon was full that night, bright and clear, the kind of moonlight that made night fighting easier. You could see silhouettes from farther away. The stars were less important for navigation. But moonlight was a double-edged sword. Lieutenant Al Gordon was flying Impatient Widow on patrol. His radar operator, Sergeant William Chen, sat in the rear compartment scanning the scope. Ground control had vectored them toward a formation of German bombers. 3 contacts, heading toward Allied positions. Heinkel, 177, heavy bombers, most likely. Gordon and Chen began the intercept. The moon lit up the clouds below like a silver carpet, beautiful and dangerous. In one of those Heinkels, Hauptmann Hans Stoll was conducting his instrument checks. Behind him, his crew was at their stations, and in the rear fuselage, 2 German shepherds named Max and Moritz lay quietly. The dogs flew on every mission. Stoll considered them good luck. It was just past midnight. The bombing run would begin in 15 minutes. Stolt was confident. The Allies did not fly at night. Everyone knew that. He was wrong. Gordon crept closer to the formation. Chen was calling directions. Gentle left, steady, increased speed. The intercept was textbook. At half a mile, Gordon spotted the 3 Heinkels visually. He chose the trailing aircraft. That would be Stoll. Gordon closed the distance carefully. The moonlight made the Heinkel clearly visible. He could see details, the camouflage pattern, the turret positions. He was 300 feet behind when it happened. The German tail gunner spotted him. The moonlight that helped Gordon see his target also revealed his position. The Black Widow's silhouette stood out against the lighter sky behind it. The tail gunner did not hesitate. He keyed his intercom and shouted a warning. "Achtung Lightning at 6 o'clock." He thought it was a P-38 Lightning. The twin booms looked similar in moonlight, but it did not matter what kind of fighter it was. It was an enemy. The tail gunner opened fire. Gordon saw the muzzle flashes an instant before the rounds hit. Cannon shells tore into Impatient Widow. The port engine exploded. Flames erupted along the wing. Something behind Gordon's head burst with a loud bang. Burning hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit. He could smell it. Hot oil and fuel. The smell of death. His instruments went crazy. Engine temperature spiking. Hydraulic pressure dropping to 0. Fire warning lights blazing red. But the P-61's flight controls were cable-operated, not hydraulic. The aircraft could still be flown even with the hydraulic system destroyed. Gordon's training took over. No panic, just procedure. He shoved the nose down to gain airspeed. The dive blew out some of the fire. He pulled the mixture control to cut off on the burning engine. The propeller windmilled to a stop. His radio still worked. He called ground control. They vectored him back toward friendly territory. In the rear seat, Chen was frozen in terror. Gordon had not told him what was happening. Chen could only feel the aircraft shaking, smell the smoke, hear the wind screaming through the holes in the fuselage. He thought they were going to die. Gordon found the airfield more by instinct than navigation. He set up for landing on one engine. The approach was rough but manageable. Landing gear came down, flaps deployed, everything still worked. Then he selected nose gear down. Nothing happened. The hydraulics were gone. The nose wheel would not extend. He had no choice. He brought the Black Widow in anyway. Main gear touched first. The aircraft settled onto the runway normally. Then the nose dropped. Metal screamed on concrete. Sparks showered behind them. The nose of the aircraft ground along the runway in a shower of orange light, but the cables held. The controls still worked. Gordon kept the wings level until they slid to a stop. He sat in the cockpit for a moment. His hands were shaking. His uniform was soaked with sweat. He was scared. He would admit that later. Anyone who said they were not scared in that situation was lying. But he had been too busy to panic, too busy trying to survive. He climbed out and checked on Chen. The sergeant was pale and shaking but unhurt. "You okay?" Gordon asked. Chen nodded. "I did not know what you were doing. I thought we were dead." "I should have talked more," Gordon said. "I should have told you what was happening. That was my fault." They walked away from the damaged aircraft together. Behind them, impatient Widow sat on the runway with her nose crushed and her engine burned out. But she had brought them home. Halfway across the world, Hauptmann Stoll was landing his Heinkel at his own base. His tail gunner was jubilant. He had shot down an enemy fighter, a P-38 Lightning. It had been on fire and going down when they lost sight of it. Stolt made the report. One enemy fighter destroyed. The kill was credited to his crew. Neither side knew they were talking about the same engagement. To the Germans, they had shot down a Lightning. To the Americans, Gordon had survived being hit by enemy fire. The truth was somewhere in between. Hauptmann Stolt would survive the war. He and his crew, along with Max and Moritz, were captured by American forces in April 1945. Years later, he would learn that the aircraft he shot down had not been a Lightning at all, and that the pilot had survived. He never stopped wondering what might have happened if they had met under different circumstances. But one lesson was absolutely clear. The Black Widow was not invincible. Under the right conditions, the prey could see the hunter. And when that happened, the hunter could die just as easily as anyone else. Moonlight was not always a friend. Sometimes it was a betrayal. Gordon returned to flying 2 weeks later. But he never forgot that night. The night the darkness failed to hide him. The night he learned that even invisible hunters could be seen. The war continued. The kill count slowly climbed. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs joined the list of victims. Japanese Bettys and Zeros fell from Pacific skies. The night fighters were proving themselves. Slowly, painfully, one kill at a time. But their greatest test was still ahead. A winter storm was coming to Europe. A storm that would ground every aircraft in the Allied air forces. Every aircraft except the Black Widows. 3 weeks had passed since that first kill over the Ardennes. Now December 16, 1944, the storm had returned, and with it Hitler's final gamble. Winter had come to Europe with a vengeance. A massive storm system had settled over Belgium and France. Thick fog blanketed the ground. Snow fell in heavy sheets. Visibility dropped to near zero, and under cover of that storm, Hitler launched his final desperate gamble. 200,000 German troops poured through the Ardennes. Tanks and infantry, artillery and supplies. They smashed through American positions. They surrounded entire units. The 101st Airborne Division found itself trapped in the town of Bastogne with no hope of relief. The Germans had planned it perfectly. The weather grounded all Allied aircraft. American air superiority meant nothing when planes could not fly. For the first time in months, German supply convoys could move during daylight. Their troops could advance without fear of being strafed. The Americans were being slaughtered, and there was nothing the mighty 8th Air Force could do about it. But there was one group of pilots who looked at the weather and smiled. The night fighters. Paul Smith stood outside the operations tent at his air base in France. Snow fell on his leather jacket. He could barely see 50 yards in the fog. Every other squadron on the base was grounded. Fighters sat silent on the flight line. their pilots frustrated and helpless. But Paul's squadron was preparing to launch. Robert Tierney, his radar operator, joined him. "They think we are crazy," Robert said. "Maybe we are," Paul replied. "But we trained to fly in worse than this. Hell, we fly every night with zero visibility. At least now we can see a little bit during the day." The squadron commander gathered the crews for briefing. His face was grim. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. German aircraft were flying with impunity, bombers hitting Allied positions, fighters strafing supply lines. All because the weather kept American fighters grounded. "Gentlemen," the commander said, "you are the only aircraft that can fly in this weather. You train to operate on instruments alone. What is impossible for every other pilot in this Air Force is routine for you." He paused and looked at each crew in turn. "The 101st is surrounded at Bastogne. They have no supplies, no reinforcements, no air support. You are their only hope. Find the German aircraft. Kill them. And if you cannot find aircraft, go low and hit their supply lines. Whatever it takes." Paul and Robert walked to their Black Widow. The ground crew had already warmed the engines, checked the systems, armed the cannons. The aircraft sat waiting. Black paint now standing out against white snow. The camouflage worked in reverse. But Paul did not care. He had been flying in darkness for 8 months. Flying in fog was actually easier. At least now there was some light to work with. They took off at dusk. The fog closed in around them immediately. Paul climbed on instruments, airspeed, altitude, heading. The numbers were all that mattered. Outside the canopy, there was only gray nothing. At 5,000 feet, they broke through the top of the cloud layer. Above them, stars were beginning to appear. Below them, an infinite sea of white clouds. Somewhere down there, men were dying. Ground control came over the radio. "Multiple bogies detected. Heavy activity across all sectors. Stand by for vectors." The hunt was on. The first contact came 30 minutes into the patrol. A German aircraft heading toward Bastogne. Ground control vectored Paul onto an intercept corps, and Robert picked up the target on radar at 4 miles. "Contact, bearing 090, range closing." Paul descended back into the fog. The world turned gray again. No horizon, no references, just instruments and Robert's voice. 3 miles, come right 5 degrees. The intercept was smooth. They had done this so many times it was automatic. At half a mile, Paul spotted navigation lights ahead. Red and green, wingtip lights. He could not believe it. The German pilot was flying with his lights on. In a war zone. He must have thought the weather made him safe, that no Allied aircraft could possibly be flying. Paul closed within 300 yards. The shape resolved in the fog, twin engines, single tail, Focke-Wulf 190, a fighter bomber. Paul did not hesitate. He fired. The 4 cannons tore the Focke-Wulf apart. It exploded in a flash that lit up the fog from inside. Then it was falling, tumbling down through the clouds, trailing fire. Paul pulled it up and away. "Splash 1. Confirm," Robert said. "Nice shooting." They climbed back above the clouds. Ground control immediately gave them another vector. More contacts. The Luftwaffe was flying in force tonight, resupplying their troops, supporting the offensive. They thought they owned the sky. They were wrong. Over the next 6 hours, the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron wrote themselves into history. Multiple crews were airborne, all of them finding targets, all of them scoring kills. The German pilots never understood what was happening. They flew through the storm confident and safe. Then suddenly they were dying, exploding in flames, falling from the sky. Invisible death was hunting them. Lieutenant Bullinger scored the first kill at 2,100 hours. The Focke-Wulf with navigation lights. Less than an hour later, he was back in the air on his second mission of the night. At 1:30 hours, he and his radar operator encountered 2 German aircraft flying close together. A Messerschmitt 110 and a Heinkel 111, both heading toward the front lines. Bullinger took the 110 first. A quick burst. The fighter came apart. He watched the crew bail out, 2 parachutes falling into the darkness. He felt something then, something he had not expected. The moonlight illuminated the parachutes clearly. He could see them swaying as they descended. Men who moments ago had been trying to kill Americans, now just falling through the sky, hoping to survive. "They are just kids," he said over the intercom. His radar operator did not respond for a moment. Then quietly, "So are we." Bullinger pushed the thought away. He turned toward the Heinkel. This one saw him coming. The bomber tried to evade, turning, diving, but the Black Widow was faster. Bullinger stayed on his tail. He fired again. The Heinkel exploded. No parachutes this time. 2 kills in one sortie. Bullinger returned to base at 0300 hours. Other crews were landing too. Everyone was claiming kills. The intelligence van was chaos. Pilots shouting reports. Radar operators confirming contacts. The operations officer trying to keep track of everything. Lieutenant Elmore and his radar operator added a Junkers 88 to the tally. That tied the squadron record. 4 confirmed kills in one night. But the night was not over. Herman Ernst, the pilot, who had scored the first V1 kills months earlier, was still in the air. Ground control vectored him toward a slow-moving target, low altitude, heading toward Allied positions. Ernst descended into the soup. The fog was thicker at low level. Visibility maybe 50 yards. He flew on instruments and trust. His radar operator called out corrections. At visual range, Ernst saw it. A Junkers 87 Stuka, the dive bomber that had terrorized Europe in the early war, slow and obsolete now, easy prey. Ernst pulled up behind it, lined up the shot, fired. The Stuka disintegrated. Ernst flew through the debris. Pieces of aircraft rattled off his canopy. He climbed back to altitude and headed home. When he landed, the operations officer met him on the flight line. 5, the officer said. 5 confirmed kills tonight. New squadron record. Ernst just nodded. He was exhausted. His hands ached from gripping the controls. His eyes burned from staring into instruments for hours. But they had done it. They had proven the Black Widow could fight in any weather. That night, fighters were not just useful, they were essential. The battle continued for days. The fog persisted. The Black Widows kept flying. While every other aircraft in the 8th Air Force back grounded, the night fighters hunted. They switched between air-to-air combat and ground attack. When they could not find German aircraft, they dropped below the cloud ceiling and strafed supply convoys. Trucks and trains became targets. Ammunition depots, fuel dumps, anything that supported the German offensive. The 422nd alone claimed 8 locomotives destroyed in 1 week. Over 300 railroad cars shot up, countless trucks burning on the roads. They were one of the only American units able to provide any support to the surrounded troops at Bastogne. The 101st Airborne could hear them sometimes. The sound of aircraft engines in the fog. The distant rattle of cannon fire. They did not know what kind of aircraft it was, but they knew it was American, and that gave them hope. December 26th, the day after Christmas. The weather had improved slightly, visibility was better, other aircraft were starting to fly again, but the night fighters continued their missions. Lieutenants Danielson and Fiala took off on an evening patrol. They were vectored toward a bogey near the Belgian border. Ground control identified it as probably a Junkers 87 Stuka. Danielson began the intercept. His radar operator, Lieutenant Fiala, guided him in. The Stuka appeared in and out of the fog. Danielson tried to get into position, but the Stuka was maneuvering erratically, jinxing left and right. Danielson increased speed to close the gap. Too much speed, he overshot. Suddenly he was in front of the Stuka instead of behind it. The German pilot saw him. The rear gunner opened fire immediately. Danielson felt impacts, heard metal tearing. He called back to Fiala, no response. "Fiala, talk to me." Silence. Danielson broke off the engagement. His aircraft was damaged but flyable. He headed for the nearest friendly airfield, an ammunition dump just inside Allied lines. He set up for an emergency landing. The landing was rough. The aircraft bounced, hit, but he got it down safely. He shut down the engines and sat for a moment. His heart was pounding. Then he remembered. Fiala had not answered. Danielson climbed out and ran back to the radar operator's compartment. He pulled open the access panel. Lieutenant Fiala was dead. 3 bullets had punched through the thin aluminum skin. The radar operator's position faced backward. He had been looking directly at the Stuka when it fired. Completely exposed. Completely vulnerable. Danielson stood there in the snow, staring at his dead crew member, the man who had trusted him to keep him safe, the man who had guided him through dozens of missions. He had failed him. Other squadron members arrived. They pulled Danielson away. Someone covered Fiala's body. The intelligence officer began asking questions, but Danielson could barely speak. Later that night, Paul Smith and Robert Tierney were briefed on what happened. They were being scrambled on another mission. Paul looked at Robert. "This one is for Fiala," Paul said. Robert nodded. They walked to their aircraft in silence. The mission was textbook. Ground control vectored them toward a Junkers 188 bomber. Paul and Robert intercepted it cleanly. Paul opened fire from 400 feet. The bomber exploded. Minutes later, ground control called another contact. A second Junkers 188. Paul pursued it. This one tried to run. Paul stayed on him through turns and dives. Finally got into position. Fired. The second bomber went down. 2 kills in 1 sortie. When Paul landed, the operations officer was waiting. "5 total now," the officer said. "You and Tierney are aces. First American night fighter aces in Europe." Paul looked at Robert. 5 kills, the magic number. They were officially aces now. Their names would go in the record books. But Paul felt no joy. Not tonight, not with Fiala dead. "We will celebrate later," Paul said. "Right now we have work to do." The Battle of the Bulge raged on. The night fighters kept flying. By early January, the German offensive had stalled. Allied reinforcements arrived. The 101st was relieved. The Germans began retreating. The crisis was over, and the Black Widows had proven themselves when it mattered most. December 29, 1944. The Pacific, Manila Bay. While the European war was reaching its climax, the Pacific Theater had its own battles to fight, and Major Carroll Smith was about to have the most extraordinary night of his career. Carroll and James Phillips took off from their base at dusk. Their mission was to protect a convoy of ships heading for Manila Bay. Intelligence indicated Japanese aircraft would attempt to attack the convoy during the night. The Black Widow times a waist and climbing to patrol altitude. The tropical night was clear. Stars bright overhead, a sliver of moon on the horizon. At 2200 hours, ground control called the first contact. Bogey inbound from the north. Twin-engine aircraft, heading directly for the convoy. Carroll turned to intercept. Phillips picked up the contact at 5 miles. They closed quickly. "Twin-engine, medium-size," Carroll reported when he got visual. Irving. The Nakajima J1N1 Irving was a night fighter itself. Twin-engine. Decent speed, but it had no radar. The Japanese pilot was flying blind. Carroll approached from below. 500 feet separation. He lined up carefully, then fired. The Irving exploded instantly. The fireball lit up the entire area. Ships in the convoy below saw it. Sailors on deck cheered. They had just watched their guardian angel kill their attacker. Carroll circled once. "One down, let us find another." Less than an hour later, ground control called a second contact, another Irving inbound. Carroll intercepted it just as efficiently. This one never even knew he was there. 1 burst, another fireball, 2 kills before midnight. Carroll landed to refuel and rearm. The ground crew worked quickly. He was back in the air by 0100 hours. At 0130, ground control reported a third bogey. Low altitude, erratic course. Carroll descended to 500 feet. Phillips picked up the contact, but tracking it was difficult. The target was maneuvering constantly, turning, circling. For minutes, they flew in darkness, trying to match the bogey's movements. Carroll began to wonder if Phillips was seeing things. But then he got visual contact. A Nakajima A6M2N, a zero-float plane. The pontoons made it unmistakable. Carroll closed within 300 feet, fired a short burst. The Zero exploded. Pieces fell into the ocean below. 3 kills. The sun would rise in a few hours. Carroll considered returning to base. They had done well. 3 confirmed kills in 1 night. That was exceptional. But Phillips called out one more contact. On the horizon, single aircraft, high altitude. Carroll could see it visually. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The aircraft was silhouetted against the dawn. "Nakajima Ki-84, Carroll said. "The Frank fighter. one of Japan's best, fast, maneuverable. In daylight, it could easily outfly a Black Widow. We should break off, Philip said. He will see us. Carol thought about it. The smart play was to retreat. They had already had a perfect night. Why risk it? But he wanted that fourth kill. One more, Carol said. We can get him. He approached from below and behind, using the sun at his back. The Frank pilot continued on a straight course. Level flight, unaware. Carol crept closer. 300 feet, 200. At 200 feet, he could see details he had never noticed before. Panel lines, rivets, the pilot's silhouette in the cockpit. The rising sun made everything visible. He squeezed the trigger. The Frank exploded at point-blank range. The blast was enormous. Fire and debris engulfed the Black Widow. Oil splashed across the windscreen. Metal fragments rattled off the wings. Smoke poured into the cockpit. Carol flew straight through the fireball. When he emerged on the other side, the Black Widow was trailing smoke. Phillips was shouting that they were hit, but they were not hit. It was the Frank's fuel and oil covering them. The enemy aircraft was gone, vaporized. Carol brought Times a Wasted back to base. When he shut down the engines and climbed out, his hands were shaking. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft, counting damage, wiping off the oil and debris. The intelligence officer approached with a clipboard. 4 kills, sir. 4 in one night. That is a record. You are officially an ace, the highest scoring night fighter pilot in the Pacific. Carol sat down on the wing. He put his head in his hands. 4 men dead, 4 aircraft destroyed. All in one night, all by his hand. Philip sat beside him. You okay, sir? I killed 4 men tonight, Carol said quietly. They never had a chance, never saw me coming, never knew I was there. It is war, sir. They would have done the same to us. I know it is necessary. I know it is my job. Carol looked up at the brightening sky. But 4 in one night, that is a lot of blood on my hands. He had achieved something remarkable, a feat that would go into the history books. But the cost was measured in lives he had taken, men who had families, who had dreams, who were now dead because they could not see the hunter in the dark. It haunted him, not immediately, but later, years later. The memory of that perfect night when everything went right and 4 men died invisible deaths. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. Germany was collapsing. Japan was retreating. The Allies were winning. But that made the night fighters' job harder, not easier. Their prey was going extinct. Fewer and fewer enemy aircraft flew at night. The Luftwaffe pulled back to defend Berlin. The Japanese consolidated around their home islands. Some night fighter squadrons went weeks without seeing any action. Some never scored a single confirmed kill. The 419th Squadron in the Pacific flew 1,972 combat missions. They claimed only 5 nighttime kills. The cost was brutal. 12 pilots killed, 8 radar operators killed, 31 aircraft lost. Most of those losses were not from combat. They were from accidents. The darkness that protected them also killed them. Flying into mountains, colliding with each other, mechanical failures in the black. The night was as deadly as any enemy. But the night fighters adapted. If they could not find aircraft to shoot down, they would attack ground targets. Intruder missions became common, flying low over enemy territory, strafing anything that moved. They developed new tactics, using incendiary bombs to light up areas, then circling back to strafe the targets exposed by their own fires. It was devastatingly effective on enemy morale. January 30th, 1945. The Philippines. 500 Allied prisoners of war were being held in a Japanese camp. Army Rangers planned a raid to rescue them. But they needed a distraction, something to keep the guards looking up while the Rangers approached on the ground. The night fighters volunteered. Dale Haberman was part of the mission. 6 Black Widows would fly over the camp, low and loud, putting on an air show, rolling, turning, making as much noise as possible. Ray Mooney, his radar operator, through 32 combat missions, sat behind him one last time. They had not spoken much since the first kill. Some things did not need words. Trust was enough. It worked perfectly. Japanese guards and Allied prisoners all stared at the sky, watching the black aircraft dance overhead. No one saw the Rangers moving through the jungle. The camp was taken with minimal casualties. All 500 POWs were freed. Later, some of those prisoners wrote thank you letters to the night fighter squadrons. Dale kept his letter for the rest of his life. It was one of the few times his work was visible. One of the few times someone saw what he did and thanked him for it. Most nights the kills happened in darkness. The victories were invisible. But not that day. That day, 500 men saw their rescuers and knew they were saved. Spring 1945, the Battle of Berlin. Germany was surrounded. Soviet forces pushed from the east. American and British forces from the west. Berlin was being squeezed. The end was near. The Luftwaffe made desperate attempts to supply their trapped troops. Transport aircraft flying at night, dropping supplies to encircled units, evacuating wounded. The night fighters were waiting. In March and April, the 422nd Squadron had its final burst of glory. 10 kills in 1 month, 7 in a single night. Almost every German aircraft they detected was shot down. Junkers 88s, Junkers 52 transports. A few fighters trying to protect them. All fell to the Black Widows. Paul Smith added to his score. Hermann Ernst got his final confirmed kill. Other pilots who had flown for months without success finally got their names on the board. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. The German pilots were exhausted, poorly trained, flying obsolete aircraft. They stood no chance. But even then, in the final days, the night fighters paid a price. Aircraft were lost to ground fire, to accidents, to mechanical failures. The war killed pilots right up until the last day. Back in the States, Colonel Winston Kratz read the mission reports from Europe and the Pacific. 5 kills in 1 night, 4 kills by a single crew, records being broken. His night fighters, the ones he had trained from nothing, were proving themselves. He had been right to believe in them, even if he had lost that $500 bet. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered after the atomic bombs. The Pacific War was over. The night fighters came home. The homecoming was not what they expected. Daylight fighter aces returned to ticker tape parades, medal ceremonies, newspaper interviews. Their names became household words. Richard Bong, Tommy McGuire, 40 kills, 38 kills, heroes of America. The night fighter aces came home to silence. Paul Smith returned to Pennsylvania. There was a small article in the local paper. No photo, no parade. He went back to crop dusting. His students did not know he had been a war hero. He did not talk about it. Robert Tierney stayed in Brooklyn, opened a radio repair shop. They met every year on December 26th, the anniversary of Fiala's death. A quiet drink, no words needed, just 2 men who had hunted together in the dark and survived. Dale Haberman returned to Iowa. He visited his father's grave and told him about the first kill, about Ray Mooney, about flying in darkness. Then he got a job as a commercial pilot and moved on with his life. Ray had returned to radio engineering. They exchanged Christmas cards for years. Then the cards stopped. Dale learned later that Ray had died of lung cancer in 1974. He wished he had called more often. Carroll Smith stayed in the military. He trained the next generation of pilots. Korea, Vietnam. He passed on what he had learned. He eventually worked under Colonel Kratz, who had become a general. Kratz never stopped advocating for night fighter recognition. But his efforts were classified, secret until his death in 1968. Carroll never received major public recognition. When he retired as a colonel, only his fellow pilots knew what he had accomplished. The Black Widows were retired almost immediately. Jet aircraft made propeller fighters obsolete overnight. The P-61 could not compete with the new generation. Most P-61s being scrapped by 1949, their legacy fading like shadows at dawn. Only 4 survived, 1 in the Air Force Museum in Dayton, 1 in the Smithsonian, 1 being restored in Pennsylvania, 1 in China. The technology they pioneered lived on. Airborne radar, night fighting doctrine, stealth tactics became standard. The F-117 Nighthawk, the F-22, the F-35, all were spiritual successors to the Black Widow. But the men who flew them were forgotten. Why? Several reasons. First, much of their technology was still classified. Radar operations remained secret until 1947. The Cold War made everything sensitive. Veterans were told not to discuss their missions in detail. Second, the nature of their work did not make good propaganda. Invisible kills, no gun camera footage, no witnesses. How do you celebrate invisible warriors? Third, their numbers were small. Only 700 P-61s were built. Only 12 squadrons deployed. Compared to thousands of day fighters, they were a footnote. And finally, the cost versus the results. The 419th Squadron example was typical. 972 missions, 5 confirmed kills, 20 men dead, 31 aircraft lost. Was it worth it? The accountants said no. The politicians said no. The public never even heard about it. But the men who fought on the ground, who were protected by those night fighters, they knew the truth. The pilots who flew the bombers and transports at night, safe because the Black Widows had cleared the sky, they knew. The truth was that the night fighters had changed warfare. They proved that night no longer belonged to the enemy. That darkness could be conquered. That wars are won not only by those who fight in the light, but by those brave enough to hunt in the dark. But by the time anyone thought to thank them, they had already disappeared. 1975, Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. Washington, D.C., 30 years after the war ended. A P-61 Black Widow sat in the main hall, one of only 4 left in the world, restored to pristine condition. Black paint gleaming under museum lights. A veterans reunion had been organized. Night fighter pilots from across the country. Some had not seen each other since 1945. Dale Haberman arrived early. He was 55 now. Gray hair, reading glasses. He looked like any other grandfather. He stood in front of the Black Widow and stared. "She looks smaller than I remember," a voice said behind him. Dale turned. Paul Smith. He had not seen him in 30 years, but he recognized him immediately. "Or we got bigger," Dale said. They shook hands, then hugged. Carol Smith joined them minutes later. The 3 men stood together for the first time. They had fought the same war, flown the same aircraft, killed the same way, but had never met. "How many people walk past this plane without knowing what we did?" Carol asked. A museum docent overheard. "Excuse me, gentlemen, were you involved with this aircraft?" "You could say that," Paul replied. "Would you like to share your story with a tour group? They would love to hear from actual pilots." The 3 men looked at each other. "No one wants to hear about night fighters," Dale said. "We were not aces like Bong or McGuire." "Actually," the docent said, "most visitors do not even know we had night fighters in World War II. "That is the problem," Carol said quietly. "We were too good at our job. We disappeared into the dark and never came back out." "But the work mattered," Paul said. "We know it mattered." "To the 101st at Bastogne," Dale added. "To the convoy at Manila. To the 500 POWs. And to the crews we lost," Carol finished. "Fiala. All the others." They stood in silence, looking at the aircraft that had defined their youth, the machine that had turned them into killers, into invisible hunters. A young boy approached, maybe 10 years old. "Mister, is it true this plane was called the Black Widow?" Dale smiled. "It was, and she lived up to her name." "Did you fly her, Trem, once or twice?" "What was it like?" Dale looked at Paul and Carol, then back at the boy. "It was like hunting in the dark, except we were invisible ourselves." The boy's eyes went wide. He ran off to tell his parents. The 3 old men stood together, veterans of a forgotten war within a war. Heroes whose names appeared in no headlines. Hunters who struck from shadows. They had proven that wars are won not only by those who fight in the light, but by those brave enough to hunt in the dark. And though their names faded from history and their aircraft turned to scrap, their legacy endured. In every night fighter that followed, in every pilot who flies on instruments alone, in every warrior who strikes from the shadows. They were the first, they were the best, and like the darkness they mastered, they slipped quietly into history. Legends who became ghosts. The museum closed at 5. The 3 men walked out together, into the sunlight, into a world that had moved on without them. The sun was setting, long shadows stretched across the pavement. Dale stopped and looked back at the museum. Through the glass doors, he could see the Black Widow, silent, dark, waiting. "Do you think anyone will remember?" he asked. Paul put a hand on his shoulder. "The ones who mattered already do." Carol nodded. The rest is just history. They climbed into their cars and drove away. Behind them, the museum lights dimmed. The Black Widow disappeared into shadow. Right where she belonged, a hunter sleeping, a legend forgotten, a ghost story that was true.